When I went to the library a few weeks ago, I wasn't fully sure what I'd look for, as I genuinely hadn't been in a long time. So I had just decided to walk around and take a look at everything I could. If anything caught my eye, I'd give it a look and decide from there. And that's how I found this book. Picking it up, I wasn't sure what it was going to be like at first. As looking at the cover, it just seemed like another war-based comic book. But then I opened it up, and my whole perception changed. This was a book about a real Army infantry regiment. Of course, it was a fictionalized version of their story, but this was a real group, the Harlem Hellfighters. In 1913, an Army National Guard regiment was formed in Harlem, New York. This regiment, originally being the 15th New York National Guard Regiment, would eventually be changed to how we know them today as the 369th. And they would go on to become one of the very few black combat regiments during World War I. These young men were fighting for their country, fighting to protect the world, and all while suffering from bigotry and racism that would push back against them. Men who were heroes, while still being treated as if they weren't equals due to the racism that still ran through the country in the early 1900s. It took quite a bit for the men emblazoned with rattlesnake insignia patches on their uniform to actually be able to see combat and serve their country, having to pretty much fight alongside the French to actually be seen as somewhat equals on the battlefield. But once in the trenches, this regiment from Harlem became one of the most influential units during World War I. Compared to all other combat units from America, it was the 369th that would see the most continuous time on the battlefield. Time spent fighting against the Germans, who would be the ones to nickname this unit the Hellfighters. I did not know of this unit before reading this book, I'll admit. And I confidently say that most of you viewing have not heard of the Harlem Hellfighters before today either. Sure, we've heard of the Tuskegee Airmen, and we know of the regiments during the Civil War, where freed slaves joined the Union Army. But throughout history, we have lost many stories of these young black men, heroes who fought for a country that didn't even fully accept them at the time. Preserving their stories and sharing their experiences is the only way we can truly share our history. History that, while not always pretty, is important because it sheds a spotlight on heroes that are otherwise forgotten. This is a similar sentiment, of course, to how author Max Brooks feels about the Harlem Hellfighters. And I really appreciate his story on why he decided to write this comic. So I want to share with you all his note to the readers at the end of the book. My interest in the Harlem Hellfighters has spanned 3/4 of my life. I first learned of them from an Anglo-Rhodesian named Michael Furmanovsky when I was 11. Michael was working for my parents while getting his MFA in history from UCLA. To me, he already was a full-fledged professor. He taught me about the British Empire, the Falkland Wars, Hiroshima, the Holocaust, and a host of other topics not covered in my 5th grade Western Civilization class. All of his after-school lessons. The one that left the deepest impression was the story of a unit of American soldiers who weren't allowed to fight for their country because of the color of their skin. To a white privileged kid growing up in the west side of LA in the 1980s, that kind of prejudice was inconceivable. When I confessed that I didn't know about them, he assured me that I wasn't alone. 10 years later, I was an exchange student at the University of the Virgin Islands. Officially, I was majoring in history with a side of political science. Unofficially, I was majoring in race relations with a side of social isolation. The experience also brought me back into the orbit of the Hellfighters. When walking through an old cemetery, I noticed some graves from 1918. I wondered if they might be casualties of the Great War. Maybe even members of the 369th. I decided to ask my professor of Virgin Islands history He was an African American from the mainland, and his intellect, eloquence, and passion set him above all of my other educators. With his beard and spectacles and flaring dashiki, he would rail against the historical crimes committed by white men from Europe and North America. Most heinous was the erasure of black accomplishments by white historians. Colonization, he told us, begins with the mind, and the best or worst way to colonize a people is to bury their past. There were no black soldiers in World War I. That was his dismissive answer to my question about the graves from 1918. When I started to argue and even bringing up the name Harlem Hellfighters, he assured me that I must have been confused with the Tuskegee Airmen of World War II. I was shocked. Here was a scholar, a crusader, a thoughtful, driven man who made it his life's mission to trumpet the glory of Africa and her diaspora. And he didn't know about the Harlem Hellfighters. I wish I could say that I decided then and there to write their story, but that would have to wait nearly another decade. In the late 1990s, I was living back in LA, just out of graduate school and trying to make a living as a writer. My decision to tackle the stories of the Hellfighters came after two TNT made-for-TV movies about the Tuskegee Airmen and the Buffalo Soldiers. I thought TNT might be interested in a story about World War I's black heroes, especially after A&E's successful Lost Battalion movie. I started collecting books about the subject. The most influential was, and still is, From Harlem to the Rhine by Arthur Little. And a year and several dozen drafts later, I pitched my screenplay to the TNT network. They passed. So did everyone else. I was told that the marketplace wasn't friendly to stories about a war that most Americans knew little or nothing about, and to focus specifically on African Americans would certainly doom my chances. All that changed when I sent my script to actor-director LeVar Burton. There are actually more than a couple Harlem Hellfighters scripts floating around Hollywood, he told me during our meeting, but yours comes closest to the truth. He agreed that the subject matter would be difficult to sell to the studios, but that by no means should that deter me. I don't have the power right now to make this movie, he said, but I'm not going to give up, and you shouldn't either. Thank you, Mr. Burton. A year later, the Hellfighters had another advocate, my new friend and fellow SNL office mate Dean Edwards. I've always wanted to do a death scene, he told me during one of our all-night writing sessions. You know, one of those looking around the corner or over a wall and bam! He pantomimed getting shot in the head. Just something tragic and sudden like that. That was my opening to describe for him the scene in my script in which Dave Scott is suddenly slayed by a sniper. I made up the scene and the character, I confessed. But the actual story of the 369th is totally real. As a black man, actor, New Yorker, and Army veteran, Dean could have not been more fascinated. Every few months, he would lean over from his desk and ask, "Hey, what's going on with your World War I movie?" And those inquiries were enough to keep my now-worn script always close at hand. 5 years and what seemed like a lifetime later, an unexpected opportunity opened up in the world of comic books. In 2006, I began collaborating with Avatar Press on a graphic comparison to my first book, The Zombie Survival Guide. I learned very quickly how different comic book writing was from prose, and how similar it could be to movie scripts. I also realized that comics presented a form of telling very visual stories without the cumbersome budget of movies or television. It seemed the ideal medium for telling the story of the Harlem Hellfighters. It's now been close to 6 years since I began working with William Christensen of Avatar Press and the amazingly talented artist Kanan White. In that time, America and the world has gone through some stunning changes. I'm not sure if those changes make the story of the Hellfighters more or less relevant. I'll leave that for you, the reader, to decide. The Harlem Hellfighters by Max Brooks, with art from Kanan White, is a must-read. It is a very intense comic and made for mature audiences. However, I truly believe this is a comic that should be read and promoted. Not only is the topic of the Hellfighters in itself something I'd promote reading this book, but it's genuinely a well-written story that showcases the struggles of Black soldiers, of Black Americans during this time. It also does an amazing job of telling just the story of true terror and violence that all the soldiers of World War I suffered through. When you combine the story with the amazing and very detailed artwork of Kanan White, you get this overall experience that just tears at your heartstrings. You feel the pain as characters within the story feel their pain. You feel the triumph as the characters feel their triumph. I've read many great graphic novels, but after reading this, I can truly say this will be the first I recommend if anyone asks me for recommendations. Now, I would have never found this book if I had never gone back to the library. I would have probably never learned about the Harlem Hellfighters if I had not gone to the library. Here I am now, choosing to research and learn, and I am so happy to just have been able to read this book and develop this desire to learn more about the 369th Regiment and its soldiers. I encourage all of you to visit your local library if you haven't in a while. You may find something there that piques your interest and gives you a new passion to learn about. There's so much to learn about and to read, and it's all at no cost. So I encourage you all to visit the library in this next week from when you see this video. Check out a book, and then comment what you checked out and if you liked it. The more of us using the local libraries, the more likely they will continue to be a thing of the future, and not just something that fades into the past. I also encourage you all to join me in studying about the Harlem Hellfighters. If you are interested in learning about them or reading this book, I will make sure to add as many resources and links to books in the description of the video below. Remember that the more we learn and the more we share the stories of our past, the more we grow and the more likely the stories of the past will never fade. I want to thank everyone who watched this video, and I ask that if you enjoyed it, please not only just like the video, but to subscribe to the channel, and also share this video with someone who you think might enjoy it. I very much appreciate everyone who supports this channel, and I'll see you next time.